Hello, my name is Sharon Gardner, and this is my presentation on DOIs, or Metadata for Intellectual Content. So what is a DOI? A DOI, or Digital Object Identifier, is a persistent handle used to uniquely identify intellectual works. So DOIs are found on journal articles, research reports, datasets, official publications, certain government information, and is now branching out into other media forms, such as through movie studios, which there is known as EIDRs. So the DOI issued is permanent, but the information's location changes over time. A DOI is made up of two parts, the prefix and the suffix. So the prefix is the identifying number issued to a registrant by the International DOI Foundation, or IDF. Registrants can be universities, government agencies, research institutes, and so on. So prefixes always start with 10 point. That 10 point shows that it's part of a DOI namespace. The suffix is the identifying number or code given by the registrant to the intellectual work. Each registrant develops its own guidelines for the suffix. For example, they may decide that an ISBN number must be included in the suffix, or the creator's initials must be included. As we see here, there's two different ways that a DOI may appear on an intellectual work. The top, which comes directly from the DOI Handbook Standard, shows first that 10 point, which is the DOI registry handle, followed by the registrant ID before the slash, and then after the slash is the object ID given by the registrant, also known as the suffix. Now, DOIs can also be written as URLs. When that is done, it always starts with doi.org before the DOI number. So what exactly does a DOI have to do with metadata? Well, if you're looking at a DOI by itself, it really doesn't tell you a lot. So DOIs have to have associated metadata. Now, that metadata has a minimum set of metadata, also known as kernel metadata, to describe the referent of a DOI name. The metadata is supported by an XML schema. The metadata standard that they use for the descriptive elements is based on the index data template. The IDF also, on top of that data template, gives a data dictionary or ontology of all the terms used in the kernel. These terms are registered by the DOI registration agencies, also known as RAs, and a tool is also provided called the Vocabulary Mapping Framework in order to assist with terminology interoperability. So the descriptive elements in the DOI kernel metadata are actually shown here in this chart. You'll see three main columns: the kernel element, how many times that element occurs within the kernel, and the description. So as you can see, it starts off with DOI name occurring once in the kernel, and the description is the specific DOI name allocated to the identified referent. So you'll notice that some of these kernel elements, for example, the referent name, occurs 0 to n times. Now that 0 to n times means that you do not have to include that information in the kernel, but if you choose to do so, it can occur 0 times, 1 time, or many times. As you can see, it gets into things like mode, character, structural type, referent type, linked creations, parties. Now there's only 3 descriptive metadata elements that are required. So you have your DOI name, your primary referent type, which discusses whether it is a creation, a party, an event, and the structural type. The structural type defines what form that particular intellectual work is taking when it's registered. So for example, if it's a digital recording or a text document. So this descriptive framework chart is based on that index data model. In addition to the descriptive metadata on file with the IDF, administrative metadata is also included. So these elements relate to the issuance of the DOI name and to the registration record itself. As you can see, there's 3 here: the registration authority code, the issue date, and the issue number. So index. Index is the metadata framework that the DOI descriptive elements are built on, and this particular index metadata framework is designed with the model of e-commerce in mind, also known as people make stuff and people do deals about stuff. Essentially, it's all about associating metadata with objects. When you associate this metadata with objects, it's meant to streamline the rights management part of intellectual property by defining the parties, how they interact, and what rights get conferred. Now, the index model has its own element definitions separate from what we saw in the DOI descriptive metadata. So, for example, they include things like the element vivacity, all right, the nature of an entity in terms of its being or having been alive. But each element in index has an assigned ID number, which is used in place of the element name. By using those ID numbers, a user can build a numeric representation of the metadata, which is why this particular metadata framework was chosen to define the elements with the DOI's descriptive metadata. Now, the vocabulary mapping framework I mentioned before is meant to automatically compute the best fit mappings between terms and controlled vocabularies in different metadata schemes. For example, if I say performance, you may say theater production, somebody else may say play, somebody else may say movie. All right, we're all talking about the same thing, but we're just using different terms. This particular method, the VMF method, is meant to promote interoperability. Now, the mapping matrix uses an event-based data model where terms from various schemes are mapped into the matrix, not directly to each other. Once mapped, the matrix establishes computable relationships with all other mapped terms, which creates a sum total of all mapped concepts and the semantic relationships between them. So, as a very brief example, because sometimes this vocabulary mapping framework can be quite extensive, let's take a brief VMF statement from Shakespeare's Hamlet. As you can see here, VMF, Vocabulary Mapping Framework, RDF, is another scheme we've come across before in this class. So, be extensible optionally, optionally extensible creation, subproperty of be extensible, extensible creation. Or, to be or not to be. That's all this vocabulary mapping framework is doing. It's just making sure we're all discussing the same thing in the same way. So now we combine the descriptive and administrative metadata and the data dictionary VMF for the ontology to create the metadata in the kernel. The kernel, or minimum metadata, is then supported by XML and joined to the DOI. So now the DOI knows what metadata to associate with it. Since the DOI considers what it's assigned to as a first-class entity, aka the thing itself, unlike a URL, which is a substitute identifier, it's not location dependent. So if the web address changes, you can still find the work associated with the DOI. However, there are still issues with DOIs. Since DOIs are based on a small set of kernel metadata, remember, you only really need 3 pieces of kernel metadata in order to build that metadata set. You can optionally extend it out by other relevant data, but the minimum is very small. When you click on a DOI link, it can direct you to either free or non-free copies of the document. So this can result in somebody having to pay for access to something that they may be able to get for free elsewhere. For example, you may click on a DOI link and it tries to send you to Gale databases, which generally are free access if you're in a public library. Or it could send you to a restricted database where you have to pay for access or pay per article. So it's not ideal because the location of the item can change over time. Sometimes the access is going to be an issue. Another issue is that you cannot just create a DOI and register it yourself directly with the IDF. You have to go through a registration agency, and this does incur a cost. However, between the IDF itself and the registration agencies, the process is technically cost neutral. And right now, there's only 10 registration RAs available globally at this time. So the one that handles most of North America is Crossref. And so, I mean, it's a limited barrier to entry. So I hope everybody learned a little bit more about DOIs and how they're constructed. And thank you very much for watching my presentation.